everyone. My name is Vasri Haran. I'm speaking today with Steve Nobel about high-frequency living. Steve is a good friend and he's an author, personal and business coach, healer, and he's been an ex-director of alternatives for around 13 years, and he's founder of Conscious Media, details which we'll give at the bottom of this podcast as well. Steve has trained in a number of metaphysical and healing modalities, and he loves working with the transformational magical energy of groups. He's author of 4 non-fiction books, most recently a great book called Personal Transitions, which draws the parallels between personal awakening and the process of global transition. So today we're going to be talking about high-frequency living. And as Steve calls it, we are living in a time of great change and opportunity. The challenge comes because we're in a time of confluence and flux where an old energy paradigm, 3D timeline, is shifting to make way for new light grids and a new ascension timeline. This is creating a certain amount of chaos and confusion, and many prophecies, the mind calendar, and spiritual teachers and channels have spoken about this time. In astrology, this is known as moving from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, and there are many signs we're at the beginning of this new age. So welcome, Steve.
Hi, Vaz. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on here. So, yeah, I'd love to hear more about this high-frequency living, and perhaps you can explain what you mean about low-frequency living and high-frequency living.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned these timelines shifting in this age of confluence, what we're having at the moment is we're almost living in 2 paradigms. There's low-frequency living, which is very 3D, which is very much about kind of people living in anxiety, fear, scarcity, shame, feeling off track, struggle is a big one, all of that stuff. Basically, not very happy, hard and unpleasant. And at the other extreme, there's something called high-frequency living, which is much more 5D, which is much more higher frequency, which is much more about people living in joy, living in a state of flow, living in experiences of synchronicity. And it's really only in that higher zone of frequency where miracles are possible, where the laws of attraction and all these other things start working. But we're basically living in a world where these two realities are possible. So a person who is living in low frequency can shift up, and equally somebody who's living in high frequency living can easily fall off and start finding themselves again living in a low frequency living. So, but in the low frequency living zone, miracles and synchronicity is not possible, no matter how much you try, and in the high frequency zone it becomes very normal.
It's so fascinating, isn't it, how we can just move and migrate between this system. How would you say, if somebody was asking how to actually assist them in maintaining a high frequency state?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, let's say someone who's really well, actually, let me take a step back, because from a kind of soul point of view, and you know, there's this idea the soul is multidimensional, that we have all these kind of past, parallel, future lifetimes, and there's a reason why we incarnate in 3D, low frequency living zone. The soul kind of, you know, when we're at that kind of level before incarnation, we have a choice, you know, where do we go? And so you might think, well, why on earth would we want to go into a low frequency 3D dense zone? But actually we choose to incarnate into these kind of places for a reason. And so some people incarnate into very dark soul families. A dark soul family would be a family which is very, very dense. You know, there's no spiritual light. There's kind of hard work going on. There might be even more darker things like abuse or even incest or violence or these kind of things. So a lot of souls choose to incarnate in dark family systems. They also choose to incarnate into dark cultural systems. Some cultures are very closed and tight, you know. Democracies tend to be a bit more open, and tyrannies tend to be a bit more closed, but it's not always so clear cut, really. So if we're in a low frequency family, for example, you know, let's say you know your parents are kind of saying to you, get real, stop daydreaming, you know, go and get a job, all that kind of stuff. It's not just a matter of meditating for 30 minutes every morning. There's things you've got to do, because you've got actually a very, very difficult circumstance around you. How do you deal with that? Similarly, if you're working in a multinational pharmaceutical company that's kind of maybe not doing very nice things on the planet, you might meditate again in the morning, but still you're basically working in a system which is actually potentially harming. Or do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So actually,
such a good point.
yeah. So, but so family particularly is a very important one. If you're in a dark soul family, and it doesn't mean people are nasty, but it's kind of dense and blocking. What you might have to do is separate from that family somehow, so you can actually feel freer to do the work you need to do. So you might have to, it's not like cutting them out of your life, but it's like stepping out of the system, stepping away from any control, or it might be even physically leaving location, so you can actually get more space to discover who you are, what you really want to do, what's your core values, what's the direction you really want to head into, and then you can start doing more spiritual exploration, and then you can go back into the system a bit more, and with that extra light, you're much stronger to actually kind of bust it from the inside. Now, I'm not speaking just from theory, because in my own family, I incarnated in what I consider a dark soul family. There was a lot of very heavy experiences in my family. My family in Britain went through both world wars. There's trauma. There was, both grandfathers fought in the First World War. Both were wounded out at the Battle of the Somme. They went through the General Strike, the Great Depression. So all this stuff is accumulating in the family. And so when I'm starting to wake up and go, oh, I want to live a bit different way, my family were quite blocking and not understanding it at all. So I had to kind of separate out. I actually got divorced from my then wife, who was, again, part of that whole system of you're not going to do this type of thing. So when I did that, I managed to get enough kind of light, enough understanding of my own journey to come back into the system, and actually to be a very, very different force in the family. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's such a great point, actually, because there's so many circumstances around. And I think one of the things that people get stuck by is, how do I move through? And there's a lot of techniques which talk about, like you say, how to shift our reality internally, but there's certain actions that need to be taken as well that reflect our circumstances. And would you say this is what you speak about, the comfort zone that all of us have, in terms of how we feel? How would you say our belief systems and our perspectives relate to that comfort zone, and how we can actually shift into a new state of being that serves us?
Yeah, well, if we're born into even an average family, there are going to be all kinds of conditioning and beliefs about life that parents can't help but pass on to you as a child. I mean, my own family were very much so. On my mother's side, they were kind of really much more harder working class. On my father's side, they were a bit more had a bit more money, but they still, both sides of the family had their kind of ideas around security and around getting a proper job and all of that stuff. So I grew up, there's me, a little kid interested in Doctor Who and Star Trek, and all these kind of magical things, and at the same time getting the message. Get a proper job, maybe creativity doesn't pay very well, forget all that art, maybe follow more sciences, all these kind of ideas. And so by the time I was 17, I was so confused, but I basically chose my family's core value of security. So I went in the banking system. I thought, well, banking is pretty secure, all right, I can get a mortgage, I can get all this cheap loans, I can, whatever, get a load of money, whatever. I completely forgot myself. So my comfort zone was around my family's idea of security, but it wasn't my own core. It's not my kind of core reasons for being here. My own values are much more aligned to creativity, spirituality, freedom, self-expression, and none of that was going to be found in the banking system, So actually, although I formed this comfort zone, there was a great deal of tension in it, because part of me wanted to bust out and part of me was terribly afraid of breaking out. So one of the metaphors I do use around comfort zone is almost like having a yacht parked in a harbour, and people move their yacht around to get different views of the sun or the kind of horizon, but they're not actually leaving the harbour to go out to sea, and that's where the soul wants us to go. So most of us are frightened to leave the comfort zone, but that's where the real adventure starts. That's where we start kind of, again, heading towards high frequency living. Very rarely do you find it in your safe harbour. There are kind of adventures you've got to take. There are kind of risks you've got to take. It's the journey of life, right? So comfort zone is formed by loads of interlocking beliefs that are kind of formed around emotions that attach to them, and family kind of locking it all in, and the cultural locking it in, which might be, in my case, it was stay safe, get a safe job, get a mortgage, marry, have a nice life, go on holiday once a year, or get by, if you feel a bit miserable, go and buy something, But increasingly I think it was the early 90s, the soul was kind of waking up inside of me and going, there's something much more than this. I remember my father died in 91, and I came away from the hospital thinking, there must be more to life than this. Just the way my family handled his death was just so British, and like, let's not express any feelings. And it was just, I just looked at it and think, this is not living. This is weird. And that really sent me on a whole journey where I did step out my comfort zone. I did start exploring, and part of me thought, am I going mad? Shouldn't I be, I've got 2 young children. I can't be doing this stuff. I can't be exploring spirituality. And certainly my ex-wife was telling me that anyway. So it was kind of difficult, but I did actually manage to break out the comfort zone and start to expand it a bit more and start getting a bit more experience around life. And I mean, really, if anybody's listening to this thinking like, well, actually, I'm in a pretty tight zone, I'm a bit scared of going out. Actually, now when I look back 20 years later, if I hadn't have done it, my life would have, I'd have missed out on 20 years of some incredible experiences, meeting some incredible people and doing some incredible things that, if I'd have stayed in that zone, yeah, I'd have had a bigger house and, maybe more nicer furniture or a bigger garden, but I wouldn't have had this richer life, and I wouldn't have been able to give that as a gift back to my own children and grandchildren.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, it just shows what happens when we can actually, it's such an individual thing as well, isn't it, to take ourselves out. I love that analogy you've got with a yacht as well, and we've got to take ourselves out into that ocean as well.
Yeah.
Would you say, because you speak about these core life lessons, and I'd love to know how you perceive the core life lessons and the core values you speak about as well, where you see they come from and how we can transmute them, benefit from them.
Yeah, well, one of the kind of assumptions I have, and a lot of spiritual teachers talk about this, is that we come into life, there's a number of reasons. One could be just to celebrate, to enjoy ourselves, to explore, but there are kind of this idea of core life lessons. It doesn't mean that life is a school, but there are certain things we come here just to kind of learn and experience, and these are pretty unique for each person. For example, some people are learning perhaps about fear and courage, that polarity, because fear is such a core force in this 3D world, that we're out of fear, we don't really live our lives. And courage is the kind of pivotal force that pushes us forward to start living, well, what do I really want to do? It might be we've come here to face things around scarcity and abundance, because really at the current system, financial systems governing the planet, basically they're leading people, the majority of people, into great scarcity and anxiety around money. But really, this is not the natural state of the universe. If you look at nature, nature operates on an abundance system. Like one sunflower would have thousands of seeds and produces whole fields of sunflowers. So nature's got that kind of more abundance principle running. In nature, you don't find anybody handing anybody any bills or invoices for, it might be around a very core thing a lot of people are facing in 3D is actually how to overcome judgment and practice compassion. This is a big lesson for some. Another one, which is, again, in 3D, male-female dynamics are kind of split so that, there's, for a long time we've had men are superior to women, or masculine traits are superior to female traits. But really in the 5D high-frequency zone, there's a synergy of the two, because you can't really live a high-frequency life if you think that part of your psyche is lesser than another part of your psyche. It doesn't make any sense. Like if you think your logical, analytical side is much more superior to your intuition and imagination side, you're not going to really be able to kind of you're not really accessing the fullness of who you are. It's crazy, actually. There might be other lessons around inner child, self-love, creativity, play, I mean, it goes on quite a lot, really. I think one core lesson a lot of people are learning is because when you do start shifting from 3D to 5D, you start learning about manifestation, co-creation, that the universe is energy, that you can actually, your inner world is a reflection of your outer world, and vice versa. You can start working with these principles to actually kind of shift reality. And the ancient word Wicca is an Anglo-Saxon word, means to bend, and they're talking about to bend reality. So even way back, our ancestors knew that reality is energy that can be bent and shaped to really for healing and for positive outcomes, not for anything, not very nice. So these are the core lessons we face. But if we're in our comfort zone, we'll never learn really truly about handling abundance or compassion or synergizing male-female dynamics or becoming more playful or healing the inner child, because when we're in our comfort zone, we never get to kind of feel any of those parts of us. We're just kind of living a kind of shallower life, watching TV, going for a drink down the pub, and there's nothing wrong with that life, but if you just stay shallow all the time, you're going to lack some depth, I think.
And on a practical level, for people listening, how would you say that we experience our spirit, the soul, calling us to move out, to break into something new?
Yeah. Well, if you're in your comfort zone, and some people's comfort zones are very tough, and so the soul needs a stick of dynamite to blow a hole in it.
I've been there.
There's two ways, really. One is the push, which is really pain. So what happens then is staying in the harbour becomes so painful, and there's so much pressure there that you just feel, I can't do this anymore. So let's give an example of a marriage. That when you marry, it's okay, you have some fun, it's great, and then you kind of basically just doing the 9 to 5 working and having a drink on a Friday night or a bottle of wine on a Sunday, and actually part of you's going, there must be more than this, and that tension starts to grow inside of you, but you don't know what that more is. But you just eventually get to a point, I don't think I can do this life anymore. That's a kind of example of pain and of being pushed out of your zone. You don't know where you're going, but you feel the push. I'm just going to go because this life is just too painful or too shallow or whatever it is. When my father died in 91, I asked the question, there must be more to life than this. When I walked away from the hospital and said that, I had no idea what that more was, but the pain was so strong. So that's the example of the soul pushing us out. The other side is the pull. So this is more like we get a glimpse of high frequency living. We get a glimpse of something calling us. We get a glimpse of, maybe we have a nocturnal dream where we dream about a different life. Maybe we read a book or go to a lecture or go to a workshop. We go, oh, I didn't know there's something I can see, outside my little harbour. There's suddenly a sunrise, and there's suddenly the sea goes on, and there's a shoreline. And so that's an example of a pull. We might decide to start our own business. We might decide to move continents. This is where the soul is pulling us. We don't exactly know why, but we get a feeling this is just right, So they're the two examples of how the soul pushes or pulls us out of the harbour.
And this place that you speak about, what I find for myself and a lot of people that I speak to, we can often get stuck in that place, the to and fro, whether it's the mind and the intuition fighting each other. How would you say that we resist moving into that new space, and how we can actually assist ourselves in, finding a clearer picture of which direction to go?
Well, the biggest resistance is fear, fear of the unknown. So we have all these parts of our psyche. We have our core soul light, and we have all these parts of our personality. And some of those parts of our personality are quite contracted, quite fearful, or maybe haven't fully matured. We might have a kind of a 5-year-old inside of us that got a bit stuck. We might have had some kind of trauma, and so we have this kind of negative ego inside of us that goes, don't do it, you're just going to fall on your face, it's all bad out there, people don't like you, these are kind of stuck ego voices. And we might also have actual voices from friends, peers, families, people we trust, that says, are you crazy? You've got a nice life here, don't give it up, what are you doing?
Right. Yeah.
So all those form a kind of resistance to moving forward. There are also more multi-dimensional resistances, which but this is usually kind of met further on along the path. When we start taking a step, we start to feel, actually, I don't know, I'm feeling a bit heavy, I'm feeling something's blocking me, and these are kind of more other lifetime blocks, which are kind of typical for people with spiritual or older souls. So, for example, an older soul who's experienced many lifetimes, and this is very common, I've met many people like this, might be very frightened of speaking their truth because they just feel at some level it's not safe. And this may come from being actually killed in many lifetimes, or tortured or imprisoned. So if you imagine that we live many lifetimes, so we have all this kind of multi-dimensional nature of the soul going on, if you can feel that, let's say, a dozen times you were imprisoned, tortured and killed for speaking your truth or following a path which is true for you, then somewhere in your unconscious you're going to get the feeling that it's not safe for me to do this. That's a kind of deeper block that kind of starts to be revealed when you start to move along the path, really.
Yeah, what I love about the way you approach things as well is that you marry the multidimensional side with the psychological, and it's great to understand it because on some level we feel that our soul is experiencing more, like you say, with those past life connections. And just coming from a multidimensional side now as well, you do speak about the laws of grace in your work. Could you explain a little bit more about that and how people can use that and how they even benefit this kind of work?
Yeah, no, I first came across these laws of grace about 20 years ago, where I started training in this system called spiritual response therapy, which is kind of a clearing system which clears out all these multidimensional blocks. And then I did lots of workshops, and I heard about all these kind of angelic forces now on the planet that are kind of giving these different violet flames, or violet blue flame, or platinum white flame, or all these different kind of, or emerald flames, which are kind of good at dissolving things. And I've been exploring them over the years and testing them on myself to see, well, actually, all right, I can feel I'm scared to move forward, or I just feel for some reason anxious about something. Let me try these different things and see what works. So over the years, I found that actually these energetic gifts from spirit, you could call them, are very effective in dissolving deep-seated blocks in the psyche, because really the blocks are in us, it's not really in the outer world. Once we dissolve these in our psyche, then we can move forward. So this is the test for me. I feel I can't move forward, I use these things, can I now move forward? Yes. Okay, tick, it works. Okay, brilliant.
Right, yeah.
I'll use it again. There are kind of various angelic races connecting with us on the earth at the moment. One of these races people call the Elohim, and at this level is where a lot of these kind of different violet ray and platinum white ray, they call it kind of dispensation, karmic dispensation. So you can actually wipe out karmic stuff in the unconscious without having to go through the karmic stuff. So in the old 3D paradigm, let's say you were a warrior, on a battlefield for several lifetimes, and then there's a certain amount of karma you accrue for kind of hacking people to bits, and you might feel a bit bad about it or something. And so in the old 3D system, you kind of work through that in sometimes painful ways. You might experience being on the receiving end, and you go, oh, this is what it feels like. It's the old 3D paradigm. But in the 5D paradigm, we actually don't need to know, okay, what it feels like to be hacked to bits. Okay, I get it. Actually, me being a warrior, there was a reason for it. I can dissolve that now and move forward. Things are speeding up, so we don't need to go through the old, slow, karmic thing, which is really a feedback system, but a very, very slow one. It goes over many lifetimes. So as time speeds up, we've got these tools really to clear these things much faster without having to be going through the pain and suffering of receiving some of the stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing how our belief systems work, and as you say, we're moving from a system where we learn through suffering into a different system. What would you say your experiences of using these multidimensional ways of working with energy to resolve karmic blocks are for yourself and others you've worked with?
Yeah, okay, let's give an example. The reason I came across this whole thing was 20 years ago. I decided, was it 20 years or it was about 20 years ago, I decided to give my first public talk with a friend who's a very experienced public speaker. I'd done a number of workshops, and I thought, hey, I'm ready to get out there, I'm ready to get on the scene. And when I went to give the talk, I completely froze. I completely couldn't speak. I said to this person, I can't say anything. You're going to have to do it. And then I realized something massive was inside of me going on. I didn't know what it was. I had spoken in front of people before, but not about spirituality like this. So then I found this system of healing, and I actually found a healer who cleared me of all kinds of stuff and said, don't worry, you've been a high priest in Atlantis, you've done this, this, and this, let's just activate some of those resources. And I was like, I looked at this woman in amazement, like thinking, what are you talking about? But then I'd actually booked another talk 3 weeks after the first one. Somehow I got it that I'll do a couple, one after the other. So I was going to do this second talk by myself. And the first one I completely froze. But when I went and did the second talk, not only was I completely fine, but actually I found a complete sense of flow. And I was like, this is incredible. I went from utter fear that I couldn't speak to completely fluidity in front of an audience. So I went and trained in the system. That's one example, or personal example, of why I got into it. I found myself going from complete fear, or it's actually more like terror of a nature I didn't understand, to complete fluidity. But over the years I've worked with many people, just trying to think of a good example. So I met someone, there was one I met 2 days ago. She was having all kinds of horrendous health problems, going through horrendous health problems. And when I checked, there was kind of chakra issues going on. There was 2 chakras going on, but the core issue was ancestral. Because it's not just actually our own other lifetimes. We're also affected by ancestral lines. So she was being affected by something that happened to her great-grandmother. In fact, so we kind of walked the timeline backwards, and I got her really to feel what was going on for her family then. That was just kind of and the words that she came out with, or her ancestors said to her, this experience felt like I was walking off the edge of a cliff. It was so shocking, and that shock has passed all the way down the family line, and it was something she was still dealing with. And so we had to work energetically to unravel that shock. This was only a few days ago, so I don't know the outcome totally, but she did email me saying, thank you so much, I feel much freer, I feel much more able to, because before that she was completely like, I can't find out what's going wrong. And I said, there's not anything physiologically going wrong, and she's had that tested, there wasn't anything physiologically going wrong. It was completely an energy problem. So it could be, energetic problems can manifest as illness, can manifest as stuckness, can manifest as an inability to go forward, not knowing your true life path. It can manifest in many ways, but there's a kind of feeling of walking through glue, or a kind of sense of terror ahead, so I'm not going to go there. They're kind of some examples of other lifetime blocks that we can kind of start dissolving. Now is a great time to do it, because 50 or 60 years ago these technologies were not on the planet as they are now. The energy's shifted so much that we could do a lot spiritually.
Yeah, it's incredible how we can work at different levels, isn't it? Would you say that we're also, on a tangent, that we're also working on a collective level, and this is why we're doing such multidimensional work in our healing work?
Yeah, I do. Yes, absolutely. That's a good point, really. I think all the work we do on ourselves has an impact on the family. All the work we do on ourselves has an impact on the culture where we're living. So, for example, in Britain, in London, is a great centre of spirituality. Great kind of lot of people coming together, working energetically. That's rippling out and shifting the culture. 30 years ago, you'd never sit on a bus and hear anybody talking about their past lives, or see anybody reading a spiritual book. But now, I've got on the underground, I've sat next to somebody talking about, do you know, it's I met this past life therapist, and or somebody, actually I met somebody reading my book on the tube. I looked at it and they were reading my book, and I was like, you wouldn't get that 30 years ago.
That's brilliant.
So culture's shifted, our language has shifted, people are more aware of a whole range of things, from health to energy to healing. Even though the media are doing a great job dumbing people down, but there's a great more awakening, and that's because of 40 or 50 years ago, it was just a handful of people just doing the work. Now that's kind of rippled out. There's more people doing the work, and that's rippling out. Goodness knows what this planet will be like in 20 years. And we were talking about that before this interview. In the next 5 years, I think we're heading for massive changes. So we're just going to hold on our hats and wait and see.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to you to that before the end of this. Just to come back on a personal level, for people listening out there, what activities, practices would you suggest that can help people on the journey as they're trying to maintain this high level of consciousness that you're speaking about?
Yeah, well, once you've decided, right, I'm going to take the journey, then you're off. If you're kind of at a place where you're thinking about taking the journey, that's kind of slightly different. Let's say, okay, you're thinking about taking the journey out of your comfort zone. Things that could help is, counseling, coaching. Silence is always good. Time for reflection, to get back to yourself. If you're kind of always listening to what your family wants or what your friends think or what your father thinks or what your mother wants, then you've got no space for what do I think, what do I feel, what do I want. A lot of people just got no space to know what they actually feel about anything. So it's good to take time out, go walk in nature. Nature's very healing. Find some way of neutralizing the negativity that's being bombarded with you all around. Switch off the TV. Don't watch the news. If you're going to get news, maybe go on social media and have a look or something, or cut out newspapers. Maybe read The Guardian once a week or something if you want to. Start to come back to yourself, start to meditate on silence, then start to think about what is it that I really want in my life? What is it that I really value? There are things like vision boards you can do. If you feel up for it, start attending workshops or talks with people who are inspiring, who are on the journey, who may be on the journey 3 or 4 steps or maybe half a mile ahead of you. So you can get a sense of people have already done this journey and, so it's possible. It's really at the beginning getting a sense of possibility, because if people feel it's impossible to do anything like that. And when I was married and living that life, I thought what I'm doing now was impossible, absolutely impossible. And taking those steps out, I had to kind of take a step out, take half a step back, going, take a step forward, maybe half a step back. It's really kind of encouragement. Finding support groups are great. Finding people who believe in you is great. Finding people who are kind of interested in what you're interested in is great. You've got to kind of get some kind of evidence around you for it's possible to start building the metaphor of a bridge towards what you want. The early steps are going to be a bit shaky, maybe. It's a good idea not to kind of make rash decisions and just like leap out. There's always a sense of timing about any journey, so a sense of preparation. There is a time maybe for leaping and going, right, I'm setting sail now, but there might be a time for actually thinking about getting a map or getting some provisions or, that kind of thing. So, of course, it's different for different people. Some people absolutely need to get to the edge and just jump off, and some people need to have a much more steadier progression. But you need to have some kind of spiritual practice, something where stillness is there, something where you neutralize the negativity around you, something where you get more support, maybe people, new friends, around you. I mean, Vaz, you've taken a step out from banking into the world you do now. That kind of journey you've taken, if you can think of that.
Yeah,
there's probably a lot more things that you'd add to it, really.
I think it's such great advice what you're giving, because it's so important to adopt things but also let go of things, like you're saying with the media, and we don't realize how much this affects our consciousness just subliminally and all the things around us, and starting to make those conscious choices, like you're saying, of things that are going to empower, inspire and take us forward is really great. And I just wanted to ask you, actually, because a lot of people, this might seem quite simple, but I think a lot of people get confused about just even the concept of intuition, of knowing what our soul wants, because a lot of people feel it's got to be this big external or this big internal voice, very clear, saying this is what you need to do. And yet often it's not quite like that. So I just, if you could just help people I find a lot of people do struggle with that. How do I know what my soul is saying?
Yeah, well, in the beginning, I used to actually do channeling classes and all this kind of spiritual work. and I used to try and listen to the voice of the soul speaking to me, or the higher self. And what I found was, in those early days, was that the ego learns to mimic the voice of spirit. And this is a tricky one, because, you know, if you get and it will mimic the kind of language, but it can't. But the actual feeling of the ego is always fearful. It's always no, don't do that, or don't go down there, or there, all that kind of feeling. Even though it might mimic the language. Hello, dear one, you know, I'm here with you, but basically, you know, don't do it, or whatever. So the voice of spirit is always one of love and expansive. It doesn't always give you advice. It might be just a feeling of gentle encouragement around trusting and loving, whereas the ego tends to think it knows exactly what you should be doing and exactly what, you know, was right for you. And the ego will always have a kind of contraction to it. It'll always have a fear to it. The soul will never have the soulful voice never has any kind of fear to it. It always sees the potential and not the kind of danger. Ego is always looking at danger. So if you're listening in and getting voices around danger, threat, and anxiety and fear, that's the ego that needs to be transformed. And in the early days, it is a bit tricky, because you don't have the kind of spiritual tools to transform the ego. You just have to kind of neutralize it and kind of go no to it. So in the early days, it's about no to that kind of voice, and rather kind of tuning into love. That's kind of I mean, that was my experience in the early days. It was like, my ego is actually mimicking my higher self now. Now, this is really difficult, you know. I found that what was more useful for me was the feeling in my body than the voices initially. So if my feeling was, I had to get a feeling of rightness about something. So if I thought, well, how do I know when something is right? And so I had to go back in my own life experience and get some examples of times where I felt something was absolutely right, and it was right. So that becomes examples of, that's the feeling of yes in my body. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And there are other times where I kind of didn't listen to my intuition. I overrode it, and I kind of knew, but I kind of went with the ego voice. And so that was an example of no, that's the ego voice telling me, and I listened to it, and that's what happens. That's the result. So slowly, in the early days, you're gaining kind of just the basic sense of yes, intuition is saying yes to this, and intuition is saying, or the ego is trying to get you to go down there, but actually it's the wrong path. So in the early days, it's kind of very clunky. It's very like you're just trying to get a kind of yes or a no response from your intuition. But the further on you go, and the more you get to know your ego, and the more you get to know your higher self, which is about developing a relationship after all. If you've never spoken to it all your lifetime, and then you start to kind of try and dial in, at the beginning it's going to be a bit clunky and difficult, and you're kind of opening the way. But eventually, if you keep the practice, you get, that's my higher self speaking, and that's my ego speaking. And that journey continues for a while, and so the ego gets transformed, and it doesn't do the same stuff in the same way. It kind of gets a little bit more subtler. As you kind of use these kind of karmic laws of grace, the ego itself becomes transformed, and you don't get those kind of crass, don't do it messages. You get it kind of, the ego kind of gets a bit more softened, and eventually on the journey of high frequency living, actually your ego is transformed. The ego becomes a vehicle for light. It's no longer a blocking force, because in 3D the ego is trained to be a blocking force. You can't open to higher frequencies. In 5D, the ego itself has to open, otherwise you wouldn't get there, because it has to be, you need a personality. Even in 5D, you know, you can't get there and become like a walking love and light being that's got no personality. Our personalities are transformed into more flexible, more useful. So I teach writing workshops, and in the writing workshops, people often wonder about their inner critic, which is a form of the ego. But what I say to people is, the further down the line you go, you train the inner critic to become the inner editor, because it's very good at editing and cutting things out. But you have to train it so well, because in the beginning stages, the inner critic wants to cut out everything practically you've written. So that's the stages with the ego.
Wow, that's a great way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, you can train it to be useful, because the ego is meant to be we have an ego for a reason. It's just it's been trained to be so negative and so blocking and so focused on survival that it can't open up and actually become an ally. It's meant to be an ally, actually. And a lot of teachers do talk about that.
That is such great advice. I think that's going to help a lot of people, especially with that confusion, because we tend to come into this confusion quite a lot, don't we? Especially in this dualistic paradigm of how to define, how to discern between them both. And yeah, that's really great. And just going on from that, I mean, that confusion which people feel you call the void. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, the void is the place between the old life and the new life. So when you've kind of got on your yacht, sailed out of your harbour and onto the sea, at some place night's gonna fall, and you're gonna go, oh my God, I've left my safe harbour. I'm at sea. It's dark. I don't know where I'm going. Am I sure I've done the right thing? You know, your hubris kind of starts dissolving. So the void is a place which feels a bit like it is a space where nothing much might be happening. You know, it might be that your old beliefs are crumbling, but the new ones haven't taken complete form yet. You know, you're learning about trust, but you're not totally trusting the path yet. So the void is a space where you might feel, oh, I've let go of everything. I've moved forward. You know, I've let go of my old job or my old marriage or whatever, and here I am in a space where, well, where's my soulmate, or where's my multi-billion-pound business, or whatever you're thinking you're gonna have. So the journey will always break our expectations as well, because the journey might be even more amazing than your mind can conceive it to be. But that might be a bit further down the path. The void is a place of challenge. We are always challenged. Our ego might kind of come back and go, you see, I told you not to do this. Why are you doing this? The void is a place where we really need to just be a witness, because our beliefs are changing, our energy field is changing. And if you can imagine the caterpillar going into the cocoon, that's the void. We don't know what, obviously, a caterpillar feels like, but as it's transforming into a butterfly, it must be a process. It's so dramatic that you just have to breathe and let it happen. It's really a lot about energy shifts going on. You still do the practice of like silence and neutralizing negative media and all that, but you're also looking out for signs of, where am I heading? Where's the light taking me? Where's the North Star calling me to? You know, or looking at your compass and going, well, when will I get a clear sense of where I'm going? And eventually, as you go through the void, the path becomes clearer on the other side. It's just something that happens, really, as we kind of really let go of old stuff. We go through a kind of final void. When you're in the void, you know that something really dramatic's happening, because on the other side is the light. The dawn comes, the light starts. Your energy system might go through a bit of a reboot, and you're more on your path. Synchronicity. Then you're in 5D. The void's not quite 5D. When you're in 5D, synchronicities start kicking off, miracles start happening, you start being able to manifest stuff, working with that law of reflection, which is in your book. You know, the world is the mirror. In the void, it's harder to work with those principles, but it gets clearer in 5D. That's my experience anyway.
And to ask you a multidimensional question here, as we move from 3D to 5D, our perception is, our awareness is expanding and everything. Do you feel that when we move into these states, we are seeing more into the world and more of the world, more of reality than before?
Well, one thing is we're seeing more of our own inner reality. We're getting in touch more with our multidimensional nature. We might actually be able to access resources within the soul that can be very helpful in this world. That example I gave you of when I first went to the healer, and she said, oh, you've been a high priest of Atlantis 12 times. And that becomes an actual resource further down the line, because I actually did a lot of magical work. And all I did was start calling into the places of me which already knew the stuff. So it's actually more than a learning. It's a remembering of stuff that we've already done in other lifetimes. So actually, and that's stuff that we can use in the world. So there are a lot of people I know, I've seen as clients, who actually want to do things and go, but can I do that? But when I've checked in their soul line, they've done it many times before. So I'm saying, you're just remembering it, just start it, and it will all come to you very naturally. So in 5D, there is a greater sense of multidimensionalness, but you're in the world. You're actually connecting all of those resources in the world. You are also able to see a lot of the illusions of the old 3D world, a lot of the stuff where, you know, things are being pulled over your eyes by maybe governments or mass media. You can look at it more and go, oh, that's not true. I know that's not right. You begin to see things in the world which were hidden before, which will become more in your reality. You know, maybe people, maybe you'll hear things which are going on in the world. Maybe your worldview will be expanded dramatically. I know we were talking about our worldviews being expanded dramatically, and we've been on the path for many years. So we've been feeling that it's rapidly accelerating. So even 5D, as 5D accelerates, even starseeds and spiritually awakened people are seeing even more and going, the world is even more amazing than I thought it was, as 3D falls away, because 3D is really totally an old illusion of density that's not real in any sense.
It's so exciting, isn't it? How do you see us? How do you see what's happening to the planet from a collective point of view on the planetary level, and where we're going over the next 10 to 20 years?
Wow. Well, I've done a lot of journeying into parallel Earths, and I've been connecting a lot with the 5D parallel Earth, which is actually one going on at the same time. And I see that reality, I see completely the world is so different. You know, there's none of the kind of environmental problems we have. There's much more sense of community, much more sense of harmony with very advanced technology and nature. There's a much more spiritual awareness going on. The Earth looks a bit different, actually. You know, it does seem to be more. Actually, I've also saw communities living inside the Earth as well as on the Earth's surface. So where this timeline is going, I imagine in 100 years we might be heading for something like that. But I see, personally, if I see on this timeline, I see a great healing between the masculine and feminine. I feel a synergy between the two. Yeah. I feel a great eruption of spirituality, which will eventually spread over the whole. It won't be just for a few crazy peoples on the fringe. It will be something the whole world embraces. I see technology going in leaps and bounds of what will be revealed to the general public. I feel there'll be things which have previously been very hidden but known to our governments, which will be revealed, which might be a little shocking for the general public to hear. I think our banking system is going to go through a revolution, or the financial system is going to go for a number of revolutions that further down the line, I don't know how much further it will go, but we might not need that system anymore. I see life on Earth getting a lot easier than it is at the moment. I see a lot of struggle, pain, war that's all unnecessary on this planet. It will just start dissolving over the decades. And for a lot of people hearing that might sound, well, that's just too good to be true. But we're so used to 3D that we can't see any other possibility, really. But I think it's had to get really bad. It's got kind of the darkest before, you know, the world's in that void of that darkness before the dawn breaks. You know, war, endless war, people being pushed through austerity programs. It's complete nonsense. The planet does not need to live that way.
And would you say this is why this awakening is happening, why so many people are feeling this, especially now? And as we were talking about before, it's accelerating so much. And with more and more people living this way, as you're speaking about high frequency living, we're going to start seeing an exponential collective shift. And this is, I guess, is what's happening right now on the planet as well. Would you, what are the principles that, as we close off, that you would say really embody this high frequency living for people to hear, just so we can connect to it internally when we're experiencing it?
Some of the principles of it, when you start shifting into high frequency living, you'll start to see the world as energy that can be shaped. You'll see yourself as energy. You'll see things like illness can only exist in certain frequency bands, that the more you shift up, the more certain things will not be able to exist in your body. You'll feel an opening of the inner channel, so the channel that there's a stargate in the Earth and a stargate in the Sun. Your inner channel can expand and connect to those stargates, and actually through the stargate of the Sun you'll feel impulses from the great central Sun, which is really the mind of God, you could say. You'll be feeling shifts in your emotional body and mental body, and maybe physical body as well. I mean, initially physically you might go through some difficult ascension symptoms, but eventually you'll feel much freer, lighter in your body. Older, heavier emotions just won't be able to exist in your 5D energy field. Things like fear. Of course, it's not that you won't get the sense of, I shouldn't be doing that, but that kind of deep-rooted fear just can't exist there. In your mind, the inner critic, the negative ego won't exist in the same way. So your mind will be reshaped into a greater sense of love, possibility, self-acceptance. And as all these things happen, the world starts to look very different. You start to feel greater sense of ease in the world. Even if you're going through the 5D world, even though the world hasn't yet transformed, you'll feel a great sense of grace, ease and flow with it. You'll start meeting people that are much more on your track, that are more supportive of you. The law of reflection, which I really love, that one, that as you completely transform yourself, as all these higher frequencies enter your energy field, your outer reality has to change. That's the law. It can't stay the same. You might see all that stuff going on, the darker stuff, but you won't be in it. You'll be kind of seeing it more at a distance.
Oh, this is fantastic, Steve. You've got so much knowledge to share as well. It's so great to hear you speak about all of this. And also your life experience. It's amazing what you've been through too. It's a very authentic and genuine experiences, which is so great. So I'd just like to mention a few of your events you've got coming up in London. Yeah. For those listening, Steve's running a Starseed and 5D Ascending Timeline workshop on the 1st of November. That's a Sunday. And all of this you can find out through LCS on the meetup. We'll put a link at the bottom. And you're also giving a talk specifically around this topic, high frequency living, on Friday, 13th of November. That's in London as well. And you've got a couple more coming up on money, work and miracles. I'm sure we'll definitely be speaking about that at another time. Yeah. But a talk on 4th of December. So have a look on www.meetup.com/spirituality and London Spirituality, sorry. And do have a look at Steve's website. It's www.stevenabel.com, which we'll put into the comments as well. And Steve, anything else you want to share before we close up?
It's always great speaking with you, Vaz.
Yeah, always great. And have a great day and speak to you soon.